Welcome to the dying world. Close your eyes. Let your body become heavy. Let the sounds of your world grow soft and distant, like torches burning down in a corridor you no longer need to walk. Tonight we are going somewhere old, somewhere beautiful and broken, somewhere that smells of cold ash and something underneath it, something that was once warmth, once radiance, once the most magnificent fire the world had ever known. Welcome back to Dream Scrolls, where the great stories of gaming are told slowly, gently, in the hours meant for rest. Tonight we make our way into the world of Dark Souls, not to fight, not to conquer, not to try again after the 10th death on a fog gate boss. Tonight we simply listen, we breathe, we let the lore wash over us, the way firelight moves across stone walls. Warm, irregular, hypnotic. This is a long story. It is one of the longest and most melancholy stories ever woven into a video game. It is the story of a world that began in nothing, found fire, used that fire to build something staggering and beautiful, and then watched the fire begin to die, and chose, in its fear and its love and its terrible pride, to do something desperate to keep it burning. It is the story of a god named Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. And it is, at its heart, a very human kind of tragedy. The story of someone who loved something so deeply that the love itself became the destruction. Someone who feared loss so acutely that the fear grew larger than the thing it was meant to protect. Someone who looked into the future and saw darkness, and in trying to prevent it, created a darkness of his own, one that would stretch across 1,000 years and consume hero after hero after hero, all of them believing they were choosing freely, none of them knowing the full weight of what they were walking toward. We will take our time tonight. There is nowhere else to be. The chapters are long and slow, and full of the kind of detail that rewards a drifting mind. Some of what I tell you, you may half dream rather than hear clearly, and that is perfectly fine. The story will find you in whatever state you are in. Dark Souls has always been that kind of world. One that gives itself to you gradually, in fragments, asking nothing but patience, and a willingness to sit with ambiguity. So, settle in. Pull whatever warmth you have around you. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. And let us begin, as all things in Dark Souls begin, in a place of grey and ancient stillness, before the fire, before the light, before any of it, before there was anything at all. In the very beginning, there was nothing that could meaningfully be called a beginning. The world existed, yes, but existence, in those first grey eons, meant something very different from what we understand it to mean now. There was no birth, no death, no change, no season, no hunger, no longing, no joy, no grief. There was simply the world, vast and still and fog-shrouded, as permanent and featureless as an ocean seen from underwater on a windless day. This was the Age of Ancients. It is difficult to imagine such a place, and perhaps that difficulty is intentional. The Age of Ancients is not meant to be imagined fully. It is meant to be felt as an absence, an epoch of pure stasis in which the very concept of difference had not yet arrived. There was no warm and cold, no light and dark, no living and dead. Everything simply was, in exactly the way it had always been, and would presumably continue to be forever. The rulers of this world were the everlasting dragons, and even the word rulers is too active a description for what they did. They existed. They perched atop the great arch trees whose roots descended into depths that had no bottom, whose canopies spread to horizons that had no edge. The dragons were enormous, ancient, and entirely made of the same substance as the world around them, stone, essentially. Their scales were not flesh that could be cut or burned. They were stone that could not be touched by any force the world then contained. They were immortal not because they fought off death, but because death, as a concept, had not yet arrived to find them. They did not speak, as far as anyone who studied them later could determine. They did not dream. They did not wonder. They endured, which is a very different thing from living. And in their endurance, they were in perfect harmony with their world, a world that also simply endured, without direction, without any sense that things might one day be different from the way they currently were. Time, in the Age of Ancients, barely moved. This is not metaphor. The cycle of light and dark that we use to measure time had not yet come into being, because light and dark were not yet distinct things. The world was neither day nor night. It was a perpetual grey hour, a sky the colour of old pewter, a landscape that had no shadows because there was no single source of illumination to cast them. Nothing aged, nothing grew, nothing decayed. The arch trees had been exactly the same height for as long as there was anyone or anything to have noticed, and they would remain exactly that height, presumably, until the end of whatever passed for time in such a world. And yet, beneath the surface of this stillness, in places where the foundations of the world grew thin and strange, something was stirring. Not quickly, not with any urgency that could be detected, but stirring, nonetheless, the way a current moves under ice, invisible from above, but undeniably present if you press your ear to the frozen surface and listen carefully enough. Something was building toward ignition. Something was about to change everything. It is worth pausing here to really sit with the world as it was in those final moments before the fire, because what the Age of Ancients represents, thematically and philosophically, is not simply a backdrop for the story that follows. It is a reference point, a before image, a definition of what the world was before desire and difference and mortality entered it. Everything that Gwyn would later fight to preserve, the warmth, the light, the growth, the meaning, had not yet existed when the dragons ruled. All of it came later, all of it came from the flame, and therefore all of it was, in some fundamental sense, temporary, contingent, borrowed from a fire that could not burn forever. The dragons did not know this. They could not have. The concept of ending was as foreign to them as the concept of color is to something that has only ever existed in the dark. They perched on their arch trees in the grey fog, and they were exactly what they had always been, monuments to permanence, living expressions of a world that had chosen, consciously or otherwise, the comfort of stillness over the risk of change. When the fire came, it would destroy that comfort entirely, and it would be worth it for a while. And then the question of whether it had been worth it would become the most agonizing question in the history of the world. But we are not there yet. We are still in the grey time, the before time, the long slow morning of a world that did not yet know it was waiting for something. Let that stillness settle around you. Let it slow your breathing. In the Age of Ancients, nothing rushed. Nothing needed to. The dragons breathed in long, slow rhythms that matched the barely perceptible pulse of the stone world beneath them. There was no urgency. There was no deadline. There was only the endless present, stretching in all directions without horizon. Rest in that for a moment. Let the fog of it drift around you, because very soon, everything will change. Very soon, in the deep places of a world that had never known depth in any meaningful sense, something extraordinary will arrive. The first flame. And with it, everything else. It came without announcement, without prophecy or preparation, without any of the grand ceremony that the events it set in motion would later be given, retrospectively, by those trying to make sense of what had happened to their world. The first flame simply appeared. There is something deeply strange about the way Dark Souls handles this moment. The games do not explain where the flame came from. There is no origin story, no divine architect who lit the cosmic match. It simply was, one day, in a place where it had not been before, a fire burning in the deep places of the world, and with it, the first experience of something that the Age of Ancients had never contained. Difference. The fact that one thing could be other than another thing. The fact that here could be distinct from there. Warm could be distinct from cold. Bright could be distinct from dark. Now could be distinct from then. The scholars of later ages would call this disparity. The introduction of it into the world was both the most creative and most destructive thing that had ever occurred. From the dark around that first flame, and there was dark now, real dark, the genuine absence of light that only exists when light itself exists somewhere nearby to define the contrast. They came, hollow creatures, shapeless and drawn, pulled toward the warmth, the way living things have always been pulled toward warmth, by something in their nature they couldn't name or explain. And in the heart of that primordial fire, these beings found something extraordinary. Souls. Not small souls, not the ordinary accumulation of life force that would later be gathered from defeated enemies throughout Lordran. These were 4 souls of immeasurable power. 4 concentrated essences of fundamental forces. 4 fragments of something that had never existed before and would never exist again in the same form, because they were themselves the consequence of the first flame's arrival. They were, in a sense, what the flame was made of, or made from, or had always been waiting to reveal. The first soul to be claimed was the soul of death. The being who took it, hollow, shapeless, drawn from the dark like all the others, became, in the taking, something entirely new. A lord. We know him as Nito, the first of the dead, the Grave Lord, the one who would become the embodiment of mortality in a world that had never before had any use for such a concept. His soul granted him dominion over ending, over the transformation of existence into non-existence, over the border between being and not being, which had previously not been a border at all, because only being had existed. Nito is in many ways the most philosophically interesting of the lords who emerged from the first flame's arrival. He is the one who brings death to a world that had been functionally immortal, and in bringing death, he brings the concept of life in any meaningful sense, because life only has value, only has texture and urgency and preciousness, in contrast to the possibility of its ending. The dragons, who would never die, had never truly lived. Nito made living possible by making dying real. The second soul was claimed by the Witch of Izalith. She was fire as creator, as sustainer, as the vital warmth that animates and encourages growth. Her soul contained the essence of life itself, not as an individual phenomenon, but as a force, a generative principle, the spark that kindles other sparks. She and her daughters would become the first practitioners of pyromancy, the first beings to understand that fire was not merely warmth but transformation, the force that could take one thing and make it something entirely different. The third soul, and in some ways the most quietly important, was found by someone who would barely register in the historical record. He is called the furtive pygmy, the hidden one, the small one, the one whose name was never recorded, because even at the moment of his greatest triumph, he lacked the grandeur that warranted remembrance. His soul was the dark soul, the one made not of light but of the space between lights, not of fire but of the profound and generative darkness from which fire emerges. From his soul, all of humanity would spring, not yet, not immediately, but eventually, as the dark soul fragmented and distributed itself through the countless descendants of this forgotten small being who had crouched in the shadows of a cosmic fire and found there the seed of an entire species. And the fourth soul, the greatest of them, the one that would carry this entire story. It was claimed by one who would be called Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight. His soul burned with the pure and undiluted radiance of light itself. Not merely fire. Fire was the witch's domain. Gwyn's soul was something beyond fire, something that fire points toward the way a compass needle points north. The light that fire produces, the illumination, the capacity to see across distances that darkness renders impassable. His soul granted him mastery over lightning. Focused light made kinetic. Sunlight distilled to its most energetic and violent expression. It made him the most powerful being who had ever existed in a world that had never previously contained power in any meaningful sense. From the moment he grasped that blazing fragment of creation, everything Gwyn would do was shaped by it. Every achievement, every alliance, every kindness, every act of cruelty, all of it would flow from the nature of that soul and from the fear, eventually, of losing what it had given him. But that fear was far away in that first moment. In that first moment, there was only the flame and the wonder of being something new in a world that had never known newness, and the 4 souls blazing with their different colors of light in the deep places of a world just waking up to its own extraordinary possibilities. In claiming their souls, the lords became the first beings to truly understand that existence could have boundaries, and that those boundaries were not a prison, but the very source of meaning. Rest in that wonder for a moment. Feel the warmth of that original fire, ancient and primordial, the first warmth in a world that had only ever known the grey neutrality of stone and fog. The four lords are gathered in the glow of it. They are not yet at war with anything. They have not yet made any of the choices that will define their legacies. They are simply there, together, holding something extraordinary, on the edge of a future that no one can yet see. It is a moment of pure possibility, and like all such moments, it is fleeting. The fire brings disparity, and disparity brings conflict, and conflict will shape everything that comes next. Perhaps it was always going to come to this. Two different principles of existence occupying the same world, one representing permanence and stasis, one representing change and disparity, and eventually finding that there was simply not room enough for both of them. The dragons had not changed in eons beyond counting. The lords, by their very nature, could not stop changing, could not stop growing, could not stop the restless creative energy of souls that burned with the power of fire and death and darkness and light. The conflict was not immediate. For a time, the two kinds of being coexisted in the same world without direct confrontation, simply because the world was vast and the newly empowered lords were still discovering the extent of what their souls could do. But the fundamental incompatibility was there from the beginning, as obvious and inevitable as the incompatibility between fire and frost. Eventually, the distance between them would close. Eventually, they would have to look at each other and decide what to do about what they saw. The dragons saw disruption. They saw beings who could not simply exist, who were compelled by the nature of their souls to reshape everything they touched, to impose the principle of change on a world that had operated successfully on the principle of permanence for longer than the concept of time had existed. To the dragons, the lords were an infection, not malicious, perhaps, but dangerous in the way that fire is dangerous to a forest. Not because the fire hates the trees, but because fire is what it is, and does what it does, and trees are what they are. The lords saw obstacles. They saw ancient beings who embodied everything that their souls were in opposition to. Stasis versus growth, permanence versus transformation, the unchangeable past versus the potentially extraordinary future. It is possible that some of the early lords tried to envision coexistence, but if they did, those attempts did not survive the historical record. What survived was the war. Gwyn was the one who organized it. This was perhaps the clearest expression of his soul's nature, the Lord's soul of light, the radiance that reveals what is hidden and illuminates paths through darkness, translated into strategic vision and political will. He could see, as perhaps no one else could quite so clearly, what the world could become if the dragons were removed from it. He could envision the kingdoms that might be built, the civilizations that might flourish, the extraordinary things that beings capable of growth and change and learning might achieve if given a world that was fully theirs to shape. He approached the Witch of Izalith, and she saw in his proposal the opportunity that her own fiery soul craved, the chance to create, to nurture, to fill the world with the teeming vitality of life. She agreed. Her daughters, those earliest pyromancers who burned with their mother's creative fire, agreed as well. He approached Nito, the Grave Lord. Death understood, in whatever way death understands things, that a world of genuine change requires the possibility of endings. Without death, nothing has stakes. Without mortality, courage is meaningless and love is merely habit. Nito and his armies of the dead would be indispensable in the coming conflict, because death was the one thing the dragons could not fight. They had never encountered it before, and they had no defenses prepared against an enemy they had never imagined. Even the furtive pygmy contributed, though characteristically without visibility or recognition. From his dark soul, he had begun the long, slow process of creating humanity, beings who carried fragments of that primordial darkness within them, who were fierce and adaptable and capable of the kind of desperate courage that only beings who know they can die are capable of. These early humans, these proto-people born from the scattered shards of a soul that had chosen smallness and hiddenness over grandeur, became the foot soldiers of Gwyn's war. They died in enormous numbers. They also proved invaluable. And then there was Seath. Seath the Scaleless was a dragon who had been born wrong, where all his kin possessed the stone scales that made them immortal and invulnerable. Seath was scaleless, exposed, mortal, vulnerable in a world where his vulnerability was a profound shame and a constant reminder that he was not truly one of them. The scales his brethren carried were the source of their immortality, and this is what drove him. He wanted what they had, the one thing he could never simply inherit. He had spent his existence watching his brothers and sisters, perched in their eternal dignity atop the arch trees, untouchable and unchanged, while he alone knew the particular torment of being a dragon who could die. When Gwyn's alliance came to him with an offer, "Join us, share your knowledge of your kin's weaknesses, and we will give you a kingdom of your own, a library and archives to pursue your research, recognition and dukedom," Seath said yes. He was rewarded with exactly what was promised: dukedom, a place in Gwyn's nobility, and access to the Duke's archives where he pursued his obsessive research into scales and immortality, the one thing he still didn't have. In choosing the Lord's side over his own kind, he was being true to something in his nature that the dragon's world had never accommodated: the desperate need to escape mortality. It would eventually consume him, driving him into the madness that darkened the Age of Fire's later centuries. The war that followed was not swift, and it was not merciful. The initial campaigns were disastrous for the Lords. The dragon's stone scales were impervious to fire, to sorcery, to the weapons that mortal hands could forge. Gwyn's human soldiers fell by the thousands, the knights he had gathered around himself, already taking on their legendary status through sheer survival and skill, were tested to the absolute limits of what they could endure. For every dragon that fell, the cost in Lord's soldiers was devastating. The turning point came when Gwyn discovered, or perhaps always knew, but had not yet tested, the true nature of what his Lord's soul could generate. The lightning he summoned was not simply a powerful weapon. It was concentrated pure light, and light, in its most focused and energetic form, could do something that nothing else could. It could strip the stone scales from the dragons, leaving their bodies suddenly and terrifyingly vulnerable to all the things they had never needed to fear. Ornstein, who would become the greatest of Gwyn's dragon-slaying knights, worked alongside his lord in developing the tactics that would turn the war. Gwyn's lightning would open the wound, peeling the stone scales away and leaving the dragons suddenly mortal. Nito's death would follow. The lore confirms that he unleashed a miasma of death and disease upon the exposed dragons, a plague of endings visiting creatures that had never before known they could end. The witch's fire would burn what remained, and Seath, guiding them to targets of maximum vulnerability with his intimate knowledge of draconic anatomy and weakness, was the intelligence that made the campaign efficient rather than merely violent. The dragons fell. Not quickly, and not easily, but they fell. Their civilization, if stillness and permanence could be called civilization, was reduced to ruin. Their great arch trees stood empty. Their knowledge was scattered, most of it lost, some of it preserved by Seath, who would spend the rest of his very long life trying to reconstruct what his own betrayal had helped to destroy. Gwyn stood in the aftermath of that war and looked at a world transformed. The grey fog was thinning. The sky was changing. The arch trees still stood, but they stood now in a world that was becoming capable of other kinds of growth, lower and more varied and more fragile, but also more alive. He had won. The age he had envisioned was becoming possible. But he had learned something in the winning that would never fully leave him. He had learned that even the most ancient and permanent-seeming things could be destroyed. He had learned that the world he was building would be built, not on eternal stone, but on something more volatile and precious and difficult to protect. He had learned to be afraid. That fear would not show itself immediately. There were kingdoms to build. There was a civilization to create. The Age of Fire stretched ahead, full of everything he had imagined it could be. The work of construction was beginning, and it was glorious work, and for a long time, for generations and centuries, The fear stayed small and quiet, like an ember banked beneath ash, waiting for its moment. But it was there. It had always been there. From the moment he watched the first dragon's scales fall away under his lightning and understood, truly understood, that permanence was an illusion. That everything, no matter how ancient and powerful, was capable of ending. He would spend the rest of his existence trying not to think about that, and failing, and eventually letting that failure consume everything he had built. Let the war fade. Let the sound of it, the crack of lightning on stone scales, the roar of the witch's fire, the cold silence of Nito's passing, let all of that grow distant now. What remains in the centuries after is something far gentler, the slow and patient work of building Anor Londo, the city of the gods. There is perhaps no place in Dark Souls that carries more emotional weight than Anor Londo, and the reason for that is not the architecture alone, though the architecture is extraordinary. Soaring spires that seem to touch a sky, now permanently illuminated, vast halls of golden stone, buttresses and balustrades and gateways that spoke of a civilization that had decided, with full conviction, that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity. The emotional weight comes from what Anor Londo represents. The full flowering of everything the Age of Fire had promised. A world that had gone from grey fog and silent stone to this, to warmth, to light, to a city of such magnificent ambition that even to walk through its empty halls, 1,000 years later, long after the gods had fled and the light had become illusion, would be to feel the echo of something that had once been genuinely extraordinary. Gwyn built it. He and those who gathered around him, the gods, the knights, the artisans and architects and scholars who found in the new world a scope for their gifts that the old world had never offered. He was not merely a warrior, this lord who had wielded lightning against dragons. He was, it turned out, a builder of uncommon vision. He understood that civilization was not merely the absence of chaos, but the active creation of beauty and order, and the institutions through which beauty and order could be sustained across time. His children grew into their own magnificence in those golden years. His firstborn son inherited his father's martial greatness and the mastery of lightning that had proved decisive in the Dragon War, a god of war whose power and bearing made him a legend, even among beings for whom legend-making was commonplace. His daughter Guinevere became the Princess of Sunlight, a goddess of fertility and abundance whose warmth was not merely metaphorical. In her presence, things grew, things flourished, things found their best and most generous expressions. She was beloved throughout the kingdom in the way that only truly kind power is beloved, not with the complicated reverence given to the dangerous, but with the simple, deep affection given to the genuinely generous. And then there was Gwyndolin, born last and born different, Gwyn's last-born son, the moon to his sibling's sun. Where they burned bright and hot, he was cool and silver and subtle, attuned to lunar mysteries rather than solar declarations. In the culture Gwyn had built, the sun was the supreme symbol of divine power. Gwyn himself was Lord of Sunlight. His daughter was Princess of Sunlight. His firstborn had inherited solar lightning. Affinity with the moon read, in that context, as deviation from everything the family represented. Because the moon was considered a feminine force in Lordran's tradition, Gwyn made the choice, one that item descriptions describe without softening, to raise Gwyndolin as a daughter. Whether this was done out of genuine confusion, cultural convention, or a father's discomfort with a child who did not fit his image of divine power, the lore does not fully explain. What it confirms is that Gwyndolin was biologically male, was identified as such by Guinevere herself, and nonetheless grew up in Anor Londo shaped by his father's inability to accommodate difference. As cursed their stur chiwe hirsta was a perstans. And nonetheless, by his father's inability to accommodate difference, I was to pass, and it pastings. Yeah, it was past tostings, because size and method. Despite this, Gwyndolin remained fiercely loyal, guarding his father's tomb, maintaining the illusion of his city, serving a legacy that had never quite made room for who he was. This was an early sign of something in Gwyn's character that would become more pronounced as the Age of Fire wore on. His inability to accept the things that didn't fit his vision, his tendency to deal with complexity not by engaging with it, but by attempting to reclassify it into something more comfortable. He was not a cruel man by nature. Everything in the record suggests genuine care for his people, genuine commitment to the civilization he was building. But he was a man who had a very particular idea of what was good, and he was not above bending reality in the direction of that idea when reality declined to cooperate on its own. His knights were extraordinary individuals. Ornstein, the Dragon Slayer, whose golden armor had seen the Dragon War's final battles, remained as the captain of Gwyn's personal guard, a living symbol of the victory that had made everything else possible. Artorius, perhaps the most purely noble of them, ranged far from the Golden City on missions of justice and mercy, becoming beloved by the human populations who looked to the gods for protection. There was something in Artorius that exceeded knightly virtue, a kind of luminous decency that made those around him want to be better than they were. Hawkeye Go was the thinker among them, a giant whose bow could strike at distances that seemed impossible, whose mind ranged as far as his arrows in contemplating the nature of the world he served. And Ciaran, the only woman among the four, moved through the world with the silent precision of someone who understood that some forms of service require invisibility, that certain kinds of protection can only be offered from the shadows. Together, these knights and the civilization they served created something that deserves to be called golden without irony. The Age of Fire in its fullness was genuinely magnificent. Arts flourished. Knowledge accumulated. The Way of White, the religious order linked to Allfather Lloyd, Gwyn's uncle, though operating broadly within Gwyn's divine sphere, spread throughout the human kingdoms, carrying with it not just ideology but literacy and medicine and the organizing principles of peaceful society. And the organizing principles of peaceful society. However complicated the political calculations behind that religious spread, the civilization it generated was real, and it produced real goods for real people who had known, in the age just prior to the fire's coming, nothing but the grey indifference of a world that hadn't noticed they existed. Gwyn, in these years, was the kind of leader that the word great was invented to describe, powerful enough to command absolute obedience, but wise enough to understand that the best civilizations are not built through obedience alone, generous with the fragments of his own soul, sharing his power with Seath, with the four kings of New Londo, with others who had earned his trust and served his vision. He was binding his world together not merely with force, but with the loyalty that comes from genuine distribution of goods. And yet, even in those golden years, even in the long afternoon of Anor Londo's first and finest century, he would sometimes sit alone in the deepest chamber of his city, in the place where the first flame was housed and tended and celebrated, and he would look into its heart, and he would notice something that no one else seemed to see. It was flickering, very slightly. Very occasionally. Not enough for alarm. Not enough for action. But enough for a man who had made fear his earliest companion, a man who had learned in the Dragon War that nothing, truly, was permanent. To feel a coldness gather somewhere behind his breastbone that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The fire was beautiful. But it was not eternal. And Gwyn, who had built his entire world on the assumption of its light, could not find a way to make peace with that. Time passed in Anor Londo, the way it passes in all golden ages, imperceptibly at first, and then, all at once, with terrible speed. The magnificent city had reached its fullest expression. The culture it had produced was rich and layered, the product of centuries of accumulated craft and learning. The human kingdoms that existed in its orbit had developed their own characters and traditions, distinct enough to be interesting, connected enough to Gwyn's vision to remain orderly. The world of the Age of Fire was, by most reasonable measures, exactly what it was supposed to be. And the flame was unmistakably dying. Not quickly, not catastrophically, not in a way that the ordinary citizen of Anor Londo or any of the human kingdoms could have pointed to and named as crisis. But Gwyn could feel it, through the deep connection between his Lord's soul and the cosmic fire that had produced it, the way a person whose body is very ill may feel the illness before any symptom manifests, as a subtle wrongness, a slight disconnection between the world as it should feel and the world as it actually feels. He had known, in some theoretical way, that this day would come. The flame had always been a thing of disparity, and disparity implies change, and change implies the possibility of diminishment. The light that had seemed infinite when it first blazed to life in the deep places of the world was in fact finite, subject to the same principle of entropy that governed every other energetic system in existence. It would not burn forever. Nothing burned forever. The knowledge of this had been manageable as long as it remained theoretical. Now it was becoming practical. Now it was becoming a problem that required a response. Gwyn turned first to his fellow lords. In the early stages of the flames fading, there was still enough of the old alliance left, enough goodwill, enough shared investment in the world they had all helped to build, that counsel between them was possible. He laid out what he was observing. He asked for their wisdom. The Witch of Izalith, ever the most confident and creative of them, proposed the most ambitious solution. If the first flame was fading, why not create a new one? She and her daughters possessed mastery over fire that approached the depth of understanding Gwyn had over lightning. If they could reverse engineer the accident that had created the first flame, if they could, through sufficient knowledge and skill and power, recreate the cosmic event that had given birth to their entire age, then the problem of a fading fire would be solved not by preserving the original but by replacing it. Gwyn tried to dissuade her. Something in him, the part that had watched the dragon's immortality shatter under his own lightning, the part that understood at a visceral level how easily even the most apparently unassailable things could come apart, recognized the danger in what she was proposing. The forces involved in the first flame's original creation were not forces that had been understood or controlled. They had simply happened, spontaneously, in a moment that could not be guaranteed to repeat itself safely. But the witch was committed, and her logic had a compelling simplicity. She went to Izalith in the deep places where her mastery was strongest, and she attempted the impossible. And for one terrible, luminous moment, it seemed as though she might succeed. A flame blazed to life in the depths of Izalith with power that rivaled the original fire. But it was wrong. Immediately, obviously, catastrophically wrong. Where the first flame had been warm and generative, this new fire was chaotic and consuming. Where the original had brought the gift of disparity, the possibility of difference, the capacity for growth, this false flame brought only its most destructive expressions. Chaos without order, change without direction, fire without warmth. The bed of chaos that emerged from the witch's failed ritual was one of the great tragedies of the Age of Fire. The witch herself was transformed. The lore tells us she became the source of all demons, a twisted creature at the heart of an ever-expanding corruption that would plague the world for centuries. Her daughters, those brilliant and creative pyromancers who had shared her vision, were scattered as demons and monsters across the landscape, still burning with fire, but fire now in service of destruction rather than creation. The daughters of chaos attempted to contain the disaster by sealing themselves around their mother's form, but even this sacrifice was not enough. The chaos spread, consuming the entirety of Izalith. Izalith was lost. One of the great powers of the Age of Fire had destroyed herself attempting to save it. Nito offered no solution. This was not indifference on his part, or perhaps it was, but a principled indifference, an acceptance rooted in his deep understanding of his own domain. His power was over death and ending. He knew, perhaps better than any of them, that all things ended, that ending was not a failure, but a natural conclusion, that the proper response to a dying flame was to allow it to die with dignity and to trust that whatever followed would find its own relationship to fire in its own time. This was wise. It was also utterly unacceptable to Gwyn, who had not built everything he had built in order to watch it dissolve gracefully into the dark. The furtive pygmy, as always, was silent. His descendants were everywhere by now, humanity had multiplied and spread throughout the world, carrying in their souls the fragments of the dark soul that would, if the age of fire truly ended, make them the inheritors of whatever came next. The pygmy had always been playing a longer game than the other lords. His silence in the face of the flames fading was not the silence of someone who had no stake in the outcome, but of someone whose stake was so long-term that the current crisis barely registered on his scale of concern. Alone among the remaining lords, without allies, without solutions from without, Gwyn turned inward. He studied the flame directly. He applied to it all the understanding he had accumulated in centuries of rule. And what he found in that deep study was both clarifying and terrible. The flame required fuel. It always had. The fuel it had used, in its first and most vigorous centuries, was the Lord's souls themselves. The immense spiritual energy that had been concentrated in those 4 cosmic fragments was the material that kept the fire burning. But that fuel was diminishing. The souls had been distributed, fragmented, shared. His own soul, once the greatest of the 4, had been parceled out to Seath and the 4 kings and others. The fire was burning through what remained at a rate that would, without intervention, lead to its complete extinction within a span of centuries, unless new fuel was provided. Unless someone with a soul of sufficient power offered it to the flame. Gwyn sat with this knowledge for a long time. He sat with it in the way that people sit with knowledge that changes everything, not quite believing it, turning it over from every angle, looking for the misunderstanding or the alternative reading that would make it something other than what it clearly was. He found no misunderstanding. He found no alternative reading. The flame was dying. The only way to preserve it was sacrifice. And the most powerful remaining soul was his own. The decision was not made immediately. There was still time. There were still years and decades in which the flame's fading was slow enough to permit the illusion that something else might be found. He used that time partly to prepare, to build the structures and systems and narratives that would ensure the survival of his work even after he was gone. But he used it also, perhaps, to grieve, to sit in the golden halls of Anor Londo and understand, in some quiet part of himself, that the age whose coming he had spent his life making possible was ending, and that his response to its ending would define his legacy far more completely than its beginning ever had. There were things he did in that time that speak to how far the fear had already colonized his judgment. The banishment of his firstborn son, that prince of war, the god of war, who at some point turned his allegiance toward the ancient dragons, was perhaps the clearest sign. The ring of the sun's firstborn tells us his foolishness led to the loss of his divine status and the erasure of his name from all records. Exactly when and why this betrayal happened, the lore leaves ambiguous. Whether it occurred during the Dragon War itself or in the centuries after, whether it stemmed from warriors' respect for worthy opponents or something deeper, we can only guess. What the item descriptions confirm is that the act was considered so transgressive that Gwyn did not merely punish his son, he unmade him, struck him from the record, made it so that even his name could not be spoken. Rather than engaging with whatever his son had seen in the dragons, Gwyn chose the absolute path of erasure. It is worth noting that the figure who many believe to be this firstborn, the nameless king encountered in Dark Souls III, that fearsome dragon-slaying war god now dwelling among his former enemies at Archdragon Peak, is never explicitly confirmed as Gwyn's son in text the player can read. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. He wields lightning in Gwyn's tradition. His crown closely resembles Gwyn's own. His title, as God of War, matches every description of the firstborn, and Dragonslayer Ornstein is said to have eventually left Anor Londo to seek him out. Whether these connections are deliberate or coincidental, the game invites us to draw the conclusion without ever quite stating it. For a story built on erasure, the ambiguity feels intentional. The banished son, whatever his name, wandered somewhere beyond the reach of his father's authority, carrying the legacy of Gwyn's lightning and Gwyn's martial tradition, and perhaps a very different understanding of what the relationship between gods and dragons might have meant. He was the first casualty of the version of Gwyn that fear was slowly producing. He would not be the last. There is something almost admirable, in a terrible way, about the thoroughness with which Gwyn planned what came next. The decision to link the fire, to offer his own soul as fuel for the dying cosmic flame, in a sacrifice that would extend the age of fire at the cost of his own consciousness, his own identity, his own existence as a thinking, feeling being, was not made rashly. It was made with the careful, long-range strategic thinking that had characterized all of his best work. Only this time, the strategy was being applied not to the problem of how to build a civilization, but to the problem of how to build a machine for consuming the souls of heroes. The dark sign was at the center of everything. Caithay's dialogue, the ringed knight descriptions in DS3, and the broader pattern of the lore together suggest that the dark sign was Gwyn's doing, a seal of fire placed on humanity out of fear. Gwyn feared the potential of the dark soul and the beings who carried it. He marked them, contained their darkness, weakened their power. DS3's ringed city makes this strongly implicit. The armor of early men was forged in the abyss, and Gwyn placed a seal of fire upon it. Whether the dark sign was a deliberate tool of control from its inception or became one as circumstances evolved, the lore leaves genuinely ambiguous. There's meaningful debate in the community, and the games reward multiple interpretations. What the dark sign undeniably did, once the Age of Fire began to fade, was to create the conditions for the cycle. Those who bore it and died would not stay dead. They returned as undead, unable to find final rest, compelled to continue existing until either some great purpose sustained them, or they lost their humanity entirely to the hollowing process that awaited those who wandered too long without will or identity to anchor them. This was elegant from a purely mechanical standpoint. It created a self-renewing pool of potential candidates. Undead could survive things that would kill ordinary mortals, meaning they could be tested through increasingly demanding challenges without the risk of losing valuable prospects permanently. Those who proved through this testing to possess souls of sufficient power and character would be guided, gradually, toward the ultimate destination, the kiln of the first flame, and the linking ritual that would preserve the age at the cost of the linker's existence as a conscious being. The guidance was provided by King Seeker Frampt, one of the primordial serpents, ancient beings whose origins and true nature remain somewhat obscure, but whose long memories and ability to move between the various states of the world made them ideal agents for the kind of long-term manipulation that the system required. Frampt had served Gwyn's purposes before, and he understood, at some level, the philosophical stakes of what they were constructing together. He was not a malicious being. He genuinely believed, or had been convinced, or had convinced himself, that the preservation of the Age of Fire was worth the systematic deception of the heroes who would be recruited to fuel it. The asylums were built as the intake infrastructure. These massive, cold, stone institutions, scattered throughout the known world, presented themselves to the public as charitable facilities, places of mercy where the newly cursed undead, who would otherwise be dangerous and directionless, could be housed and cared for, and perhaps eventually reintegrated into society if a cure were ever found. There was just enough truth in this presentation to make it believable. The key detail the dark sign item description gives us is that humans branded with it were rounded up and sent to the undead asylum to the north, and the asylum demon's description notes that it was placed there to ensure only worthy undead could escape. From what we can observe, the asylums were built not merely as prisons but as filters. The most capable undead could fight their way out. The rest would stay until they hollowed. Whether Gwyn deliberately designed this as a screening system, or whether the arrangement evolved more organically from simpler intentions of containment, the lore leaves open. What is clear is the functional result. Only those strong enough to overcome the demon and the asylum's obstacles would make it out, and those who did were exactly the kind of souls the flame needed. The most promising candidates were given their opportunities to escape, in ways that appeared to be lucky accidents or the interventions of sympathetic strangers. The knight known to the community as Oscar of Astora, his name comes from unused game files rather than any dialogue spoken in the game itself, where he appears only as the Knight of the Undead Asylum, carried a key and a family legend about the undead prophecy. Whether Oscar was an agent of the system or simply a believer in the prophecy who acted on his own conviction, the game does not say explicitly. What we can observe is the effect. He provides the key, imparts the prophecy, and passes his purpose to the Chosen Undead. The system reads the same regardless of whether Oscar himself was aware he was playing a role in something larger. The randomness appeared accidental. The destiny felt personal. The freely made choice was the product of a situation constructed to feel inevitable. The path from the asylum to Firelink Shrine was the first stage of the psychological conditioning that would make heroes willing to feed themselves to a dying fire. Firelink was chosen because it occupied a kind of geographic and symbolic crossroads, a place where multiple threads of the world's narrative converged, where the undead had access to both the bonfires that sustained them and the voices of those who would guide their understanding of their situation. Frampt waited there, in the ruins below the shrine, in the church's sunken watery chamber, patient as an old stone, ready to offer his counsel at precisely the moment when a newly liberated hero would be most receptive to it, waking only once both bells of awakening had been rung, as if the sound itself was his signal. His approach to each hero was different in its particulars but identical in its structure. Establish trust through accurate information about the immediate situation. Offer a framework that makes the hero's undead status feel meaningful rather than merely cursed. Describe the linking quest in terms calibrated to the individual's deepest motivations. And never provide the full picture of what linking the fire actually entailed for the one who did the linking. He did not lie, exactly. This is an important point, and a philosophically troubling one. Everything Frampt told the heroes was true. They were chosen. Their sacrifice would preserve the age. The flame required fuel of exactly the quality their souls possessed. The world would benefit from their willingness to take on this burden. None of this was false. What was omitted was equally significant. They were not the first. Dark Souls 3 makes explicit what Dark Souls I implies. The linking had happened before, multiple times, the cycle turning over and over since Gwyn's original sacrifice. Their sacrifice would not solve the problem permanently, but only postpone it. They would not die heroically and then find peace. They would be absorbed into the flame and spend however long the fire needed consuming them, and alternatives to linking existed, were being actively discussed by certain figures in the world, and had not been presented to them because their knowledge of alternatives was considered a risk to the system's continued function. This omission was perhaps the darkest part of the whole construction. It was not the sacrifice itself that was the moral catastrophe. Sacrifice, voluntary and informed, is a genuine form of nobility. It was the removal of genuine consent, the engineering of a situation in which heroes believed they were choosing freely when in fact they were choosing from a menu curated by those with interests that did not fully align with their own. The trials themselves, the bells of awakening, the Lord Vessel, the gathering of the Lord souls from the four great sources, were both practical preparation and psychological investment. Practically, they strengthened the hero's soul, making it more valuable as fuel for the flame. Psychologically, each challenge overcome made it harder to walk away, having spent months or years in pursuit of a goal, having sacrificed other goals and relationships and possibilities in its service, having survived things that should not have been survivable. Walking away becomes an act of self-negation, a declaration that all of it was meaningless. Most heroes cannot make that declaration. The system knew this. It was designed around this knowledge. Gwyn, in constructing this architecture, was not thinking of himself as a villain. He was thinking of himself as a father willing to do whatever was necessary to protect his children. As a king whose responsibility to his people exceeded any other consideration. As a lord who had already shown his willingness to sacrifice himself, and was now, simply, building the infrastructure that would allow others to follow his example and extend the benefits of his sacrifice across time. The tragedy is that this self-understanding was not entirely wrong. His love for the Age of Fire and for the people who lived within it was genuine. His willingness to pay any price for their protection was genuine. The problem was not his intentions, but his inability to see the difference between protecting something and possessing it so completely that the protection itself becomes a cage. He had loved his world into a prison, and now he was building the machine that would keep the prison staffed with willing wardens, generation after generation, none of them knowing they were guards rather than saviors. The most sophisticated form of control is the kind that makes those being controlled feel that they are acting freely, because then they will do the controlling themselves without any need for force. The cycle that began with Gwyn's first linking did not operate seamlessly or without friction. That much becomes clear when you study the scattered lore of the centuries that followed. The system adapted. It had to. Heroes arrived with different personalities, different motivations, different vulnerabilities to different forms of persuasion. The religious infrastructure that Gwyn had established through the Way of White had to evolve to accommodate these variations, developing increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks for explaining the undead curse and the necessity of linking the fire in terms that resonated with each new cultural moment. The first few Lords of Cinder after Gwyn himself were presumably the most successful in terms of the fuel they provided. Their souls, shaped by the same age of fire that had produced the original linking, carried within them the accumulated spiritual weight of a civilization at its height. They burned long and bright, each linking providing centuries of renewed flame before the next crisis point arrived. The system's administrators, Gwyndolin in the throne room of the illusory Anor Londo, Frampt in the depths below Firelink's shrine, the various religious orders spreading the necessary narratives through the human kingdoms, could afford, in those early centuries, to be patient and selective. There was time enough to wait for heroes of exceptional quality, but as the centuries accumulated, the math became less forgiving. Each successful linking consumed some portion of the spiritual resources available. The human population, despite continuing to reproduce, and despite the ongoing fragmentation of the dark soul, producing new undead candidates in every generation, was not generating souls of equivalent power to those of the early age. Something about the process of civilization, the comfortable routines, the inherited traditions, the increasing distance from the raw creative energy of the world's first transformation, seemed to produce beings of gradually diminishing spiritual intensity. Or perhaps the flame itself was simply growing more efficient in its consumption, more demanding of what it required per unit of extension. The relationship between a dying fire and its fuel is not linear. A small fire burns through fuel slowly. A desperate fire, clinging to existence against the natural entropy that wants to extinguish it, burns through fuel in ways that are neither predictable nor economical. The failed Lords of Cinder, those beings who linked the fire and were consumed by it, but who for various reasons did not remain in the kiln, who returned to the world in states of half-consciousness, carrying the residue of fire without the purpose that the linking was supposed to provide, became, in time, one of the system's most troubling byproducts. They wandered. They sat in thrones. They occupied corners of the world with the distracted, abstracted presence of beings who had done something enormous and irreversible, and were now struggling to understand what to do with the remainder of their existence. Some of them tried to warn the heroes who came after them. This was perhaps the most poignant aspect of their continued existence, the fact that they had been through the fire and had enough consciousness remaining to articulate something about the experience, but not enough credibility with the system's administrators to have their warnings taken seriously, and not enough cognitive clarity to articulate those warnings in ways that would break through the deep conditioning that made heroes resistant to hearing them. The failed lord sits on a throne and says something like, "You don't understand what you're walking toward." And the hero, conditioned by months or years of carefully managed narrative to believe in their own special destiny, hears this as the bitterness of someone who wasn't strong enough, who lost their way, who failed where the hero will succeed. The system had anticipated this dynamic and incorporated it. The failed lords were not obstacles to be removed, but cautionary illustrations, living examples of what happened when commitment wavered, when faith faltered, when the hero proved insufficiently dedicated to see the quest through to its completion. They served the machine, even in their failure. This is perhaps the most darkly elegant aspect of Gwyn's architecture. It had no waste products. Everything that the system produced, including its failures, became material for the continued operation of the system. The failed lords inspired fear of failure in future heroes, the hollow wanderers who lined the roads of Lordran, illustrated the fate of those who lost their humanity. The ruins of previous ages showed what happened when fire was not maintained. Every negative example reinforced the positive case for linking the fire. It was airtight, or nearly so. What it could not account for, what no system designed by a sufficiently frightened mind can fully account for, was the persistence of curiosity in beings who had been built from the dark soul. Humanity, as the inheritors of the furtive pygmy's legacy, had within them a drive toward understanding that could not be permanently suppressed. Questions, once genuinely asked, had a way of demanding answers. Doubts, once genuinely felt, had a way of refusing to be permanently buried under the comfortable weight of received wisdom. The scholars who preserved dangerous knowledge, the questioners who found each other across the centuries and compared what they had observed, the occasional hero who survived long enough and saw enough to start pulling threads that the system would have preferred remain untouched. These were the slow accumulation of pressure that would eventually produce the crack through which the truth could enter. And when the crack came, it came in the form of a small, shapeless being who had always been in the shadows, whose name had never been recorded, whose influence had always been felt more than seen. The serpent who served the dark soul's interests rather than the fire's. The one who had been waiting, patient as a primordial thing can afford to be, for the cycle to finally generate a hero who was ready to hear the full story. Carthay. Darkstalker, the other voice in the deep places of the world. He had been there all along, moving in counterpoint to Framp's guidance, offering his own version of the truth to those few heroes who sought him out. Carthay's location is telling. He waits in the abyss, beneath the flooded ruins of New Londo, accessible only to those who drain the cursed water and descend into the depths where the four kings had once ruled. To reach him requires a deliberate detour from the main path, a willingness to go into exactly the kind of dark place that the whole system had been designed to make people fear and avoid. He did not coerce. He did not deceive in the way that Framp deceived, or at least, his deceptions were of a different kind, oriented toward a different outcome, in service of a different vision for what the world should become. He was the dark soul's advocate, the champion of the age that Gwyn had spent 1,000 years trying to prevent. And in the final cycle, when the Chosen Undead made their way down to him, he was ready to give them what no previous hero had been given, the complete picture, without strategic omissions, and the genuine choice that followed from it. Let's be quiet for a moment before this chapter. Let there be a breath of space around what we are about to consider. Because whatever else is true about what Gwyn did, and there is much that is complicated, much that is morally problematic, much that the rest of this story will show to have been catastrophic in ways he did not anticipate, what he did at the kiln of the first flame was also, on one important level, profoundly moving. He gave everything. Not as a metaphor, not as a rhetorical flourish. He walked into a fire that he knew would not merely kill him but consume him, dissolve his identity, erase his consciousness, reduce the greatest lord the world had ever known to a hollow shell, animated by the mechanical echoes of his former skill. He did this knowing, fully and completely, that he would not be the Gwyn who walked in anymore by the time the process was finished. He would be something that wore his body and wielded his sword, but had no access to his memories of building Anor Londo, no capacity to miss his daughter's warmth or his son's lightning, no ability to grieve or regret or wonder if he had made the right choice. He did it anyway. The Black Knights who accompanied him were his most loyal, the ones who had served since the Dragon War, who had been there at the beginning when all of this was still just vision and lightning, and the shared belief that the world could be more than grey fog and stone silence. They walked with him not because they were commanded to, but because loyalty of that depth does not know how to stop being loyal even when loyalty leads to fire. They were transformed too. The Black Knight's charred appearance, those hollow suits of blackened armor that wandered Lordran for 1,000 years, points to an encounter with a fire more chaotic than Gwyn's controlled sacrifice. Based on item descriptions indicating they battled chaos demons in the conflicts that preceded the linking, the Black Knights may have already been scorched before the final march. It seems the first flames burning completed or compounded a transformation already begun in those earlier battles. their bodies reduced to empty armor, animated by the ghost of their former devotion, wandering the world endlessly, unable to find rest, unable to remember what they had once served or why. They would persist for 1,000 years, these Black Knights, attacking anything that came near them with the mechanical accuracy of their former training. If there is something that can be called sadness in a being that has lost the capacity for emotion, then perhaps the Black Knights embody it. All the form of devotion, none of its substance. The flame blazed up when Gwyn entered it. That much is certain. The light that had been dimming throughout the world returned in full strength, pushing back the encroaching dark that had begun to gather at the edges of Lordran's reality. The Age of Fire was preserved. The great buildings and institutions and relationships that Gwyn had spent his life constructing continued to exist. From the outside, from the perspective of everyone who was not Gwyn himself, experiencing the consuming fire from within, the sacrifice had worked exactly as intended. But inside the flame, Gwyn was burning. The process was not instantaneous. This is one of the things that makes his situation so particularly brutal. He did not simply cease to exist in the moment of the linking. The flame consumed him gradually, the way a fire consumes a great piece of wood, the outer layers first, then deeper and deeper, working inward through layers of personality and memory and understanding until what had once been a complex and feeling being was reduced to carbon and the basic structural integrity of the form that remained. For however long the process took, and the sense of time within the flame may be very different from time outside it, we can infer from the state in which heroes find Gwyn that the transformation was thorough, consuming not merely his power, but whatever interiority had once animated it. The hollow form that greets the Chosen Undead is not Gwyn in any meaningful sense. It is the mechanical residue of Gwyn, his skill without his mind, his body without his will. Allowing ourselves to imagine what the transition between those two states might have involved, the gradual erosion of memory, of feeling, of the self-awareness that allowed him to understand and grieve what was happening, gives the linking its full tragic weight. Whether that process was slow or instantaneous, agonizing or peaceful, the game does not say. What remains speaks clearly enough about what was lost. What remained was the Guardian, the Lord of Cinder, a being with Gwyn's form and Gwyn's combat skills and Gwyn's armor and crown, but without Gwyn's thoughts or memories or sense of self. A fossil of the greatest Lord, preserved in the posture of power without the animating intelligence that had made power mean anything. He would sit in that posture for 1,000 years, waiting for the next hero to come and destroy what remained of him, so that the process could begin again. Anor Londo, in the aftermath of the linking, became a city of illusions. Gwyndolin remained, the last-born son whom his father had raised as a daughter, now the only true deity left in a city from which all others had quietly departed. He used his mastery of illusion magic to project an image of his sister Guinevere in the throne room, a radiant, welcoming presence designed to encourage heroes who reached that place to accept the Lord Vessel and continue toward the kiln. The Dark Moon Knights maintained the false sunlight over the city. The Silver Knights remained at their posts. The architecture remained magnificent. But the life had gone out of it, and behind every warm light was a small, solitary figure maintaining the performance through sheer will and devotion to a father who had never quite known what to do with him. It was, in a very real sense, a stage set, a backdrop for a drama that would repeat itself, with variations, for the next 1,000 years, every detail designed to produce the emotional response necessary to keep heroes walking toward the fire, the warmth of the eternal sunlight, which was now maintained artificially rather than naturally, the grandeur of the architecture, which spoke of a civilization that deserved to be preserved, the princess's blessing, which gave heroes the permission they needed to believe they were making a free and sacred choice. All of it true, in its way. All of it also a performance carefully maintained to ensure that the machine kept running. Gwyn had walked into the fire to save his world. His world had been saved in the narrow sense he had intended, and in every other sense, everything he had valued had been slowly, carefully, systematically disassembled to keep the machine running, that preserved the shell of what he had loved. 1,000 years is a long time to sit in a fire. Let that settle for a moment. Not metaphorically, literally. Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, has been burning since before the oldest records that any living being in Lordran can access. There is no one alive who remembers him as he was. There are stories, carefully maintained religious texts, the architectural testimony of Anor Londo, the mechanical loyalty of the Black Knight phantoms, but the living memory of what it meant to be in the presence of the genuine Gwyn, the warmth of his attention, the weight of his authority, the feeling of standing near a being who burned with something more than ordinary fire, that is gone. What remains in the kiln of the first flame is something that is difficult to look at directly if we are being honest about it. He is charred. His body, which was once radiant with divine power, is the color and texture of the inside of an old hearth, dark and crumbling at the edges, held together by some principle of integrity that should have given way long ago but hasn't, because the fire still needs something to guard it. His great sword, which once channeled the purest expression of solar power, flickers with flames that are too weak and too warm and too orange, not the white gold lightning of his prime, but something more like the fire in a dying campfire, reaching upward out of habit rather than strength. And the crown, still on his head, still marking him as king of gods, ruler of the greatest civilization the world has ever known, lord of the age of fire. A mockery, now, in the way that crowns on scarecrows are mockeries, not because the object has changed, but because the relationship between the object and the being wearing it has been severed so completely that the symbolism has inverted. It no longer says, this being has authority. It says, this being once had authority, and the fact that the authority is gone has not caused the crown to leave. In that one to leave. There is something deeply important about the fact that heroes must fight Gwyn before they can link the fire. It is not simply an obstacle in their path. It is the most morally complex moment in the game, for those who have been paying attention. Because what they are fighting is not an enemy. It is a victim. They are defeating, in single combat, the direct consequence of the choice they are themselves about to make, the evidence, living and present, of what becomes of those who link the fire. Gwyn fights back, of course. His hollow form attacks with the mechanical precision of a lifetime's worth of martial training, preserved long past the lifetime that generated it, the same techniques that once stripped the scales from everlasting dragons, the same footwork that made him legendary among beings who defined legendary. But there is nothing behind the attacks. No calculation, no adaptation, no curiosity about the particular strengths and weaknesses of the particular opponent in front of him. He is executing a program, a very sophisticated, very deadly program, built from a lifetime of expertise, running without a consciousness to direct it toward anything beyond its basic function. Heroes who reach him describe, in the scattered lore notes and the emotional texture of the encounter itself, a profound and unexpected sadness. This is not the satisfaction of defeating a great enemy. It is closer to the feeling of performing a mercy killing on something that should have been allowed to die long ago but was kept barely alive by forces that had their own reasons to need it continuing. Those heroes who are paying close enough attention to really feel the weight of the moment will notice something strange in the timing of his attacks. There are pauses, not tactical pauses, not the deliberate hesitations of a fighter reading their opponent, but something more like the pauses of someone struggling to remember what comes next in a sequence that they have performed so many times that it has ceased to carry any meaning. Brief moments in which the Hollow Lord seems to catch himself in the act of repetition, to register some faint and inarticulate awareness that something about this situation is being endlessly recycled before the program reasserts itself and the next attack begins. Whether those moments represent genuine residual consciousness, some fragment of Gwyn's original self, buried so deep under centuries of burning that it can barely make itself felt, or whether they are simply the glitches of a very old system running on inadequate power, is impossible to say with certainty. The lore leaves this ambiguous, perhaps deliberately, because the ambiguity is the point. It should matter to heroes whether there is something still suffering inside the hollow crown, It should make them think about what they are preparing to do to themselves. When the fight is over, the heroes are left alone with the flame. The flame is smaller than they expected, perhaps. The kiln of the first flame is a vast and echoing space, built to house something of cosmic magnitude, and the fire at its center is flickering. Low. Exhausted from the 1,000 years of slow consumption of Gwyn's essence that has been its sustenance, it is clearly in need of what the heroes have been sent here to provide. And the heroes must decide. Some of them, standing in that moment. Looking at what remains of the greatest lord, looking at the fire that consumed him, feeling in their bodies the weariness of the journey that brought them here, make a different choice than the one they were sent to make. They do not link the fire. They walk away from it, allow it to continue its natural decline, take the first steps into an unknown future that the entire system was designed to prevent. Others proceed with the linking. They step into the fire as Gwyn once did, and the fire blazes up, and the world outside continues in the light that their sacrifice provides. And they begin the long, slow burning that will turn them, in time, into what they have just defeated. Neither choice is presented as obviously correct. Neither is rewarded with clarity or celebration. The game ends, both endings end, in ambiguity and silence. Because Dark Souls understands something that few games are willing to commit to. Some questions don't have answers. Some choices are genuinely impossible to evaluate from the outside. Some sacrifices are both noble and wrong simultaneously, in proportions that shift depending on who is doing the measuring and what they are measuring for. Gwyn's hollow crown is the image that persists. The symbol that carries the whole weight of what the Age of Fire ultimately became. Not the golden halls of Anor Londo, not the triumph over the dragons, not the beautiful, sun-drenched civilization of the middle centuries. The hollow crown, the throne of ash. The charred form of a man who loved so desperately that the love destroyed everything it was meant to protect. After 1,000 years of cycles, heroes rising, completing their quests, linking the fire, being slowly consumed, leaving their hollow forms to wander the paths they had once walked with purpose and hope. The system that Gwyn built finally arrived at something it had not been designed to accommodate. A hero who knew the whole truth. The Chosen Undead, in the final cycle of the Age of Fire, is different from their predecessors not in power or courage or the quality of their soul, but in information. Through the accumulated contradictions of the system, through the voices of those who had been questioning its premises across the centuries, through encounters with Darkstalker Seath, the other primordial serpent, Frampt's counterpart, the one who had been working against the cycle, rather than for it, this final hero had access to the full picture. They knew about the deliberate manipulation, about the asylums as screening facilities rather than charities, about the manufactured destiny and the curated prophecies, about the fact that previous heroes had walked this path, that the Chosen Undead was not unique, that the title Chosen was a marketing decision rather than a metaphysical fact. They knew that Carthy had his own agenda, that Frampt had his own agenda, that neither serpent was offering pure and disinterested guidance. They knew that the Age of Dark that the entire system existed to prevent was not the catastrophe it had been presented as, not an age of evil, but simply the next phase of natural development, the age in which humanity would finally come into its own as the true inheritors of the dark soul that had seeded their species. They knew, in short, everything that previous heroes had been denied. And they still had to choose. This is the heart of what makes the Chosen Undead's situation philosophically interesting, and why their story has resonated so deeply with players across the years since Dark Souls first appeared. The availability of full information does not make the choice easier. If anything, it makes it harder. Because now there is no comfortable ignorance to retreat into, no simple heroic narrative to follow, no clear delineation between the right path and the wrong one. The case for linking the fire remains genuinely compelling even with full information. The Age of Fire, for all its corruption and artificial extension, produced real goods for real people. The civilizations that flourished under its light were not simply props in a deception. They were genuine human achievements, real expressions of what the species could create given the opportunity. The transition to the Age of Dark, even if that transition is ultimately healthier in the long run, would not be costless. Things would be lost. Structures that people had built their lives around would dissolve. The light that had warmed generation after generation would dim and die. The case for walking away from the fire is equally compelling. Every hero who has linked the fire has been consumed. Every Lord of Cinder has followed the same trajectory from noble sacrifice to hollow guardian. The system designed to preserve the age has instead turned it into something barely alive, sustained through the continuous sacrifice of the individuals who should have been building something better. The Age of Dark is not an apocalypse. It is a natural transition, the world finding its own level, humanity coming into a birthright that was theirs all along and was taken from them by a god who loved his creation more than he trusted its capacity to survive without him. Both of these cases are right. Both of them are genuinely right, simultaneously, in ways that cannot be fully reconciled. This is what Gwyn's legacy actually consists of. Not a clean heroic narrative or a clean villainous one, but an inextricable tangle of genuine love and genuine harm, of real beauty and systematic cruelty, of the best intentions and the worst outcomes, all of it wound together so tightly that pulling one thread threatens to unravel all the others. The battle with Gwyn that precedes the final choice is, in this context, the most important battle in the game, not because of its difficulty. Experienced players find ways through it that reduce the mechanical challenge considerably, but because of what it requires the player to hold in mind simultaneously. They are fighting a victim. They are fighting a version of their possible future self. They are fighting the loving, terrified father of an entire civilization, reduced to automatic violence by a system he created in love and fear. They are also fighting an obstacle, a hollow guardian, a thing that attacks them not from malice or strategy, but from pure conditioned response. And when he falls, when the last of what was Gwyn collapses, and the light fades from whatever the flame was doing to animate him, there is a silence that the game handles with unusual care. No triumphant musical swell, no congratulatory message, just the silence of the kiln, and the fire, and the choice that has been waiting patiently, at the end of this entire 1,000-year story, for someone to finally make it with open eyes. Link the fire, and the age continues. You burn. You become what you defeated. The machine keeps running. Perhaps the next hero will make a different choice. Walk away, and the age ends. The dark rises, natural and unhurried, the way night falls after a long day. Humanity begins whatever it will become in a world that is finally, genuinely theirs. The light of the Age of Fire flickers out, and the world takes a breath in the darkness, and whatever comes next begins. Dark Souls does not tell you which ending is correct. The sequel games, and the third game especially, explore the consequences of both choices across multiple cycles, suggesting that neither solves the underlying problem, that the Age of Fire keeps returning whether linked or not, that the question of fire and dark is not one that admits of a final answer so much as a continuous renegotiation, which is perhaps the point. Some questions are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be asked, again and again, in each generation, by each new set of people who are old enough to understand what is being asked and what it costs to answer. The Chosen Undead's greatest gift to the world was not their particular answer, but their insistence on genuine choice. They proved that the question could be asked honestly, with full information, and that the choice could be made freely after 1,000 years of manufactured destiny and engineered consent, that restoration of authentic decision-making was itself a kind of triumph, independent of what was decided. We have come a long way together tonight. From the grey silence of the Age of Ancients, through the blazing arrival of the first flame, through the Dragon War, and the building of Anor Londo, and the long golden years, and the first flicker of doubt, and the desperate sacrifice, and the 1,000 years of hollow cycles, and the final choice in the kiln, we have traced the shape of a tragedy that is, at its deepest level, a very simple story told in very complicated ways. Someone loved something so much that the love became a cage, and the cage became a machine, and the machine ran for 1,000 years on the fuel of noble hearts. Dark Souls is not a game that offers easy comfort. It is not a story that resolves into clarity, but it does, if you listen carefully enough, offer something that functions like wisdom, not the wisdom of easy answers, but the wisdom of having sat with a very hard question for a very long time and learned the shape of its difficulty. Gwyn was not wrong to love the Age of Fire. It was genuinely worth loving. The light and warmth and beauty, and meaning that the flame had brought to a world that had none of those things were real goods, and the desire to protect them was understandable in anyone, let alone in the being who had sacrificed so much to bring them into existence. His love was real. His fear was real. His sacrifice, whatever else it was an expression of genuine devotion. What Gwyn got wrong was the relationship between love and control. He believed that loving something meant preventing it from changing, from being vulnerable to loss, from existing in the ordinary world where things end. He believed that the highest expression of his care for the Age of Fire was to keep it exactly as it was, forever, regardless of what that preservation cost. And in believing this, he made the mistake that the story suggests is the most fundamental mistake available to powerful beings who love impermanent things. True preservation is not freezing. It is tending. It is the kind of care that allows the thing being cared for to continue growing and changing and finding its own form, rather than the kind that fixes it in place and then defends that fixedness with whatever force is necessary. Gwyn was a magnificent warrior and a gifted builder, but he was not, ultimately, a good tender of what he loved. He was a possessor of it, and possession of a living thing is always, in the end, its diminishment. The human beings in this story, the ones who bore the dark sign, the ones who were recruited through the asylum system, the ones who walked the path to the kiln, believing themselves chosen and unique and the agents of their own heroic destiny. They are not simply victims, though they are partly that. They are also the story's deepest expression of what the flame was actually for. The Age of Fire was not meant to be an end in itself. It was meant to be a context in which beings like this could develop, could grow into wisdom and courage, and the particular kind of love that comes from knowing that things are temporary and choosing to care for them anyway. Gwyn prevented this. His desperation to preserve the context consumed the purpose. He kept the stage but lost the play. He maintained the theater but burned the actors. And yet, and this is the part that makes Dark Souls something other than a simple cautionary tale, even within the corrupted system he created, moments of genuine beauty persisted. Solaire of Astora, a knight who came to Lordran as an undead to find his own personal son, pursuing that strange and luminous quest with a warmth that the political machinations above him could not touch. The long-running fan theory that Solaire might be Gwyn's banished firstborn son, drawn from his covenant with the Warriors of Sunlight, which is historically connected to that lost god, was largely put to rest with Dark Souls 3's introduction of the Nameless King, whose dragon-slaying war god credentials align far more precisely with the firstborn's description. Solaire appears to be, in the end, exactly what he presents himself as, a knight from Astora of exceptional skill, whose strength came entirely from his own rigorous training rather than any divine gift, which, in a world built on divine manipulation, might be its own form of freedom. The unnamed scholars who preserved dangerous knowledge across the dark years, the knights who served without knowing fully what they served, but who served with genuine commitment and genuine skill. The friends that the Chosen Undead made along the way, complicated, broken, beautiful people, trying to find meaning in a world designed to strip meaning from everything it touched. Beauty persists in broken systems. This is one of the things that Dark Souls understands that not every dark story manages to hold on to. The corruption of the Age of Fire does not retroactively erase everything the age produced. The hollow crown does not mean the crown was never worn by something worthy of its weight. The tragedy is not that the Age of Fire was worthless, but that a world capable of producing such beauty could not find a way to let it live and grow and change without trying to own it completely. As you drift towards sleep, carry this with you if you like, or let it go if it is too heavy. The flame always fades. This is not a catastrophe. It is a rhythm. The natural world operates in cycles that none of us fully understand, in which things end and other things begin, and the question of whether what follows is better or worse than what preceded it is often unanswerable from inside the cycle. What we can do, within whatever age we find ourselves, and this is the lesson that the Chosen Undead embodies at their best, is to make our choices honestly, with as much information as we can gather, with genuine care for those who will be affected by them, and with the humility to acknowledge that our love for particular things does not give us the right to prevent those things from living their own lives, finding their own forms, ending in their own times. Gwyn's fire has been burning for 1,000 years inside the world of dark souls. Outside that world, in this one, it has been burning in the imaginations of everyone who has played these games and felt the particular quality of melancholy that the lore produces, that feeling of standing in the ruins of something great and knowing that the greatness and the ruin are not separate things, but are, somehow, the same thing viewed from different angles. That feeling is not despair. It is something more honest than despair. It is the acknowledgement that the things we love most are exactly as fragile as we fear they are, and that this fragility is not a flaw but a feature, the thing that makes love necessary rather than optional, the thing that makes care meaningful rather than merely habitual. The first flame is fading. It has always been fading, and in its dying light, everything is visible with a clarity that full brightness never quite manages, the shapes of things as they are, rather than as we wish them to be, the shadows of what we have built alongside the buildings themselves, the faces of the people we have dragged into our systems and our fears and our desperate attempts to keep one particular moment from becoming the past. Rest now. The world of dark souls is still out there, waiting in the grey space between sessions, patient as an arch tree. Gwyn is still in the kiln, sitting in his posture of hollow authority, the crown on his charred skull casting no shadow, because there is no light in the kiln of the first flame bright enough to cast one anymore. The flame flickers, the ember endures, and somewhere, in a cell in an undead asylum, a figure is stirring, not yet awake, not yet ready for what is coming. Just beginning, in the darkness, to notice that somewhere not far away, a key has been placed just within reach. The cycle turns, the fire calls, and the story, as it always has, begins again. Sleep well. The great arch trees of the Age of Ancients still stand somewhere beneath all of this, patient and permanent, waiting in the deep geological time of a world that remembers what came before the fire. They do not mourn the dragons who once sat upon their branches. They do not celebrate the Age of Fire that replaced the Age of Ancients. They are simply there, rooted in a kind of existence that neither the fear of loss nor the hope of preservation can reach, because they have never needed either. They simply are. And in their being, they hold something that neither Gwyn's golden age nor any age that follows it has managed to contain. The quiet dignity of a thing that is entirely itself, asking nothing of the world, offering nothing, requiring nothing. The hollow crown is in the kiln. The first flame flickers. The chosen undead has made their choice, whichever choice it was, and in the silence after, in the moment before whatever comes next begins, the world breathes. Just breathes. As you are breathing now, slowly, settling into the comfortable weight of the blankets, and the pillow, and the merciful dark behind your eyelids. This is what rest is, perhaps. This is what the Age of Ancients was, in its way. Not stagnation, but the deep rest between one kind of being and another. The pause between the exhalation and the next breath. The moment in which everything is genuinely quiet and genuinely still and genuinely enough, without needing to be preserved or defended or kept burning at any cost. Let the fire fade, for now. There will be morning enough later, and the world will still be there, complex and demanding and full of choices that want to be made. But right now, in this hour, let Gwyn's long story settle into the quiet part of your mind that holds things without needing to analyze them. Let the hollow crown become just an image, beautiful and sad and true the way all truly human things are beautiful and sad and true, and let it rest there softly as you rest. The Age of Fire is ending. The embers are banking low. And somewhere in the darkness that follows, something new is beginning to stir, patient and unhurried, moving in the way that the most important things always move, not with lightning or great ceremony, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide coming in, a seed splitting underground, a flame deciding, finally, that it has been burning long enough, and that it is time to let the dark take the world for a while, and let whatever needs to grow in that darkness grow. Good night.